Great day to everyone tuning in today, hoping you are doing well. If not, you may visit another podcast after hours that talks about emotional topics. Para sa amin muna, but anyways, I am your host for this episode, Glaiza Silvestre, and welcome to another episode of Talk It Out with Pascal. In this episode, we will be having a discussion about being a writer and a writer's block with our guest, Kaiser Sta.Ana.
Hello, Glaiza. It's great to be a guest on the podcast. Writer's block is something I've wanted to discuss with others before, and I'm glad I finally had the chance to talk about it with such a large audience.
Hello. Thank you for being here with us, Kaiser. Likewise, I am also thrilled about our topic since I actually been curious about how writers deal with setbacks and when a block happens. But before we start our podcast, how are you today?
I'm honestly doing great. I'm actually having my morning coffee right now, so I'm full of energy. How about you?
That's great. It's nice that you are feeling energized today. And to answer to your question, I'm doing better than usual. Thanks. And it's actually because of our episode today. It's nice to just sit and think and talk about things we're interested in. It can be a really great way to distress and loosen things up a bit. Also, based on the topic of our podcast that I mentioned earlier, we are going to talk about writer's block. Now, Kaiser, can you give us your definition of what you understand writer block is?
To be completely honest with you, writer's block is actually a contested topic in the creative world. Some people think that it doesn't exist while others do. I personally belong in that latter group. For me, writer's block is when you're unable to feel inspired anymore. It makes creating new ideas and developing a story much more difficult.
Oh, I see. How does it feel to experience writer's block, or how does it feel to be uninspired?
It feels strange to be completely honest. One day you're full of ideas and motivation to write a story and next it's all gone. Sometimes it takes a while to fully realize that you've hit a block in creativity, and it is hard to accept for many a first time writer, especially when it happens at such an early stage in their journey. Because of that, it becomes really easy to feel demotivated to continue writing a story when you're in the midst of a block.
That sounds tough, but let's elaborate on that later with questions. But first, since you're a writer, I can't help but be curious how much you have accomplished in it. So I want to ask, are you currently working on a novel right now?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm actually on a break at the moment. I have a novel in the works, but I don't want to stress over it so much, so I'm putting it on hold for the time being.
It's great that you're taking care of yourself, but I can't help but wonder, what is your novel about? I'm kind of curious how a novel would look like that is still being developed.
I don't want to get into the specifics here, since I want it to be a surprise when people read it, but it's a more romance driven story. It's more of a lovey dovey sort of story with a twist. I have wanted to write about romance for a very long time, so I just wanted to have fun with it this time.
Ooh, romance, huh? People mostly like romance these days. I wonder what kind of twist you're talking about. I want to ask you more, but like you said, it might spoil some people who want to read your novel. Are the novels you write more on fantasy or romance?
I have been more of a fantasy writer for the longest time, which only makes sense considering how I got into writing in the first place. But as I said earlier, I have been meaning to write a romance for a while now.
It's great that you want to explore romance more. I've also been meaning to read more romance-related books since most of the books I've been reading have little to no romance and fantasy stuff, so I'm not too familiar with it. Oh, but we might have gotten a bit sidetracked. But anyway, back to the topic at hand. Since you write mostly on fantasy, it must be tiring to constantly think about new things or unique ideas by yourself. Have you ever experienced a time when you can't think about anything, or you can, but the idea is just so bland but that is just not acceptable for you?
I actually have experienced this before. It's not as common now, but it was a very common issue when I first started writing. At the beginning, I simply thought that every idea should be new and unique. So I constantly mulled over special and outlandish ideas and concepts to add to my stories. This led to stories which were very difficult to develop since I wanted them to be completely unique.
Since you were constantly thinking about ideas, how long was it before you experienced your first writer's block?
I guess it was only a few months into writing when I first experienced it.
Oh, were you aware about writer's block before, or were you just confused that you couldn't come up with ideas like usual?
I had only learned about writer's block a few years ago, so I was very confused when I first experienced it. At the time, I had decided to try and brute force my way through the period and force myself to create new ideas. That is a very bad idea, by the way.
How bad was it?
Well, I never was able to continue that story because of frustration, if that's an indication of anything.
It do be like that sometimes. Anyway, after learning about writer's block, did you try to do anything to be released from this block?
I tried many things to try and get out of it, and most of them were ineffective. Ultimately, while it seems counterproductive, taking a break from writing is what helped me most. Not thinking about the story and doing other things for a while really helped me get back in the groove of things when wanted to start back up again.
Would you say that it's the same feeling as burnt out?
I think that the two are similar feelings, but are different in some aspects.
Alright, we got that. Continuing the topic, what do you think is the best way to deal with writer's block?
I think the way I dealt with writer's block is the best way to deal with it universally, by taking a break once in a while. Taking breaks from writing can help you become more imaginative since you won't be using your brain 24/7 and creating ideas and plans for your story. As with all things, overworking often leads to negative results, after all.
I do agree with you. Everyone needs to rest once in a while, because if they don't, then they will probably end up with a serious consequence that will result in them having to take a longer break than if they actually rested for a bit before anything serious happened. Also, speaking of breaks, would you consider reading as a form of resting? Like, writing must be a bit frustrating at times since you have to constantly think about what happens next or what event should take place to suit the situation of the character in your story. So, would reading a finished story be someone's rest?
Rest can be anything a person finds relaxing. A lot of writers I know love to read books when they take breaks, and, well, I do sometimes as well. It's a productive means of relaxation too, as it helps a lot with creativity, even if you aren't actively thinking of ideas. Well, how about I ask you a little question? I feel a bit bad considering you're the one doing all the work so far.
Oh, yeah, sure. What is it?
Well, I know you've written some things in the past as well, so I want to hear some of your thoughts on writer's block.
I have written some short one shots in the past, though I cannot say if they are actually worth reading. But at first, when I started to write them, I could not calm down because I just had so much ideas in my head, and I wanted to put some of it into the short story I was writing. Eventually, I put some, excluded some, since the other ideas I had was confusing, and if I were to put them in the story, the plot would not make any sense. Though after I finished probably two short stories, and that's when I started to breathe. Though I had so many ideas going on in my head, I just could not for the life of me start writing, and if I did force myself to write, none of the sentences would make any sense.
Hmm. Well, that is another form of writer's block, funnily enough. I find it to be a sort of information overload. It happens to the best of us.
Oh, it probably is. I'm not the type of person to write my ideas in the first place. I would prefer if I showed them through illustrations. That is probably why I got tired quickly. It was a nice experience though.
You are more of an artist than a writer, so it's only to be expected. Anyway, did you try to alleviate your block in any form? I know that you do like to read a lot, so did you try breaking free through it, literature? And if so, what kinds of books did you read?
I can't say I have tried to alleviate it. I was just doing nothing, but at the same time, not resting. The constant flow of ideas just would not let me rest, and also because of it, I cannot write since I wanted to entertain them all. But I probably just got overwhelmed without noticing. But when I would actually separate myself from writing, I would go to apps that had published books and read them. I guess that could be called resting from writing. But now that you've asked me what I read back then, I would say that it was a lot of fantasy with a hint of romance, or just pure fantasy. I just can't enough of it. I did read some pure romance books, but I found myself dozing off most of the time. So when I found a combination of romance and fantasy, I could not be happier. Though sometimes that could also be a little tricky. Let's say I was reading a book that is mostly fantasy, and that fantasy part has a unique concept, great characters, and a nice storyline, and that other side of this romance. But if that part is not executed in a cringe manner, poorly written, or is so obvious that readers are just not given the chance to guess and speculate, it ruins the whole thing for me. I would rather just read pure fantasy.
Yeah, it is easy for badly written romance to ruin an entire story, since it is also a driving force for the plot of a story, so it needs to be kept suspenseful. Though, sometimes it is nice to just read a, what's the word? Cringeworthy romance. Anyway, that's what you read before. What do you read now?
Okay. Actually, it's mostly the same, but I have been reading this Marin-based novel that currently has 1,300 chapters that is still updating. It doesn't have romance surrounding the main character, but it hits the plot, character development, and world building so well that small moments actually make a difference. Also, it isn't just focused on the main character, but also the development of the side characters and the antagonist himself. He also goes through development like the main character and does not remain stagnant. I could literally go on and rant about my favorite novel for hours, so you should probably stop me here.
Wow, to read such a long novel, you must like it a lot. I could not imagine myself reading something so long.
Yeah, I really do. But earlier, before I ranted on the things I read, we were on the topic of different people dealing with writer's block in different ways. So, would you say that dealing with writer's block differs from people to people?
I don't think dealing with this differs from person to person. Every writer I've spoken to has said they deal with writer's block in the same way. What I can say, however, is that writer's block is more of a personal experience more than anything. The phrase writer's block is more of an umbrella term for problems that arise in writing.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. People write their own stories, so it's probably normal to have their own sets of problems as well. Well, personal problems should take some time, especially if you're dealing with it yourself. So, how long do you think can a writer's block last?
Honestly, writer's block can last for a while, but its length depends mostly on how you deal with it. Personally, the longest one of these that has lasted for me is about a full year.
Dang, that's quite long. Must have been a difficult time for you.
Yeah, it was very difficult for me at first. I couldn't believe that I could not make any new material for such a long period at the time. To be completely honest, it made me consider if writing really was something I liked doing or not.
Dumb. It really is like that sometimes. But we'll see in the future because we'll be waiting for your novel. But that's all for today. Thank you so much for being a guest here, Kaiser. We appreciate you sharing your thoughts and experiences here in one of the episodes of Talk It Out with Pascal.
Thanks for having me.
I hope everyone has had a great time listening and learned a thing or two about being a writer and the struggles of being one. Thanks again.